Jeremy, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I'm delighted to have you. Um, I guess my first question is thinking about scenario and scenario thinking. A number of viewers and listeners of the podcast will not be familiar with what it actually is. So, could you perhaps tell people who are not familiar with what scenario thinking is, what it is, and probably also equally important, what it is not?
Okay, no, I'm happy to do that. And I'll probably kick off with what it is not, because there's a popular perception that this is something about predicting or forecasting the future in detail. And that's clearly impossible. And it's not that. What it is an approach to exploring future possibilities so you can learn more about what are the main kind of features in the future landscape and the critical uncertainties in that landscape. And from learning and understanding that better, you can make wiser decisions now that are going to play out into some kind of future landscape. So, in a sense, it's fundamental to making those wiser decisions because there's huge currents, very powerful currents that are shaping our world. Whether we think of macroeconomic or geopolitical currents, but also social currents, technological currents, market currents. And all of these currents stimulate countercurrents. And you can't tell in advance which are going to be the strongest. So alternative possible outcomes are always going to be plausible. And that is so fundamental that if you ignore it, you're doing lazy strategy. This is about an approach to thinking about the future that recognizes this fundamental feature of the plausibility of alternative future landscapes, and then connecting that into when I understand better the main features and the main uncertainties, what are the consequences for what I should do now? So that's a little bit about the what I call scenario thinking.
Yeah, and I think you just touched on the word a lazy strategic planning or lazy strategic exercise. How do you see exactly? Because there's a lot of confusion about it. How do you see the relationship between scenarios and strategic planning?
Well, I think it's really very integrated. It's
Hmm.
an integral part of that, and that was actually reflected in my own history, where as you know, I was privileged to lead the scenario and strategy activities in Shell for 16 years. And I was on the leadership team of corporate strategy. So the way of thinking in this way was integral to the way of thinking about all strategic issues. So it was an important part of that. It was part of what I call being fundamental and secondary. Fundamental in the sense that I've explained, but also secondary in that it's a means to an end, and that end is better decisions. And so once you've developed over time and keep up that dialogue about what ways the future could form,
Hmm.
then you're into the consequences for your strategic choices at all levels. And so scenario thinking, I think, is actually more significant than any particular scenarios that are developed.
Yeah, yeah. It's more the mindset and the activity and the continuous engagement. Yeah,
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 and that engagement is important because one of the other aspects of it that people sometimes neglect, and I'm sure we'll come back to this later,
yeah. We'll go
but
back. Yeah,
you'll be familiar, and a lot of the people who are listening to this will be familiar with the work of behavioral economist Dan Kahneman,
yeah,
who only just very recently passed
yeah,
away, which is
yeah.
really sad. And Kahneman has these two phrases that are well known. One is that what you see is all there is. We know intellectually that's not the case, but we behave very often as if
Yeah.
it is the case. And so you need to be able to think about seeing beyond what you see currently immediately, what you're immersed in every day, what your experience has been, so what you have seen in the past. So having different perspectives and pulling them together is part of that. But also, he emphasized so-called thinking fast and thinking slow. And our default is to think fast. Which is basically pattern recognition from what we know already.
Yeah.
It's a harder activity to think reflectively, think slowly. Both can be very important, but you really have to put effort into thinking slowly. And the kinds of scenario conversations and the scenario development forces people into thinking more reflectively. And I think that's another fundamental part of the work of the scenario approach.
I think a lot of people will have to question why organizations should invest in scenario planning in the first place, because it takes a lot of effort. As you said, the future is unclear. So what do you see as the value or the business case or the potential return on investment of scenario thinking?
Yeah, it doesn't have to take a lot of resource because it's almost a mindset. But when you really pursue it seriously, you have to put in the resources and the effort, to build the processes of what I call strategic conversation that include scenario thinking. One measure of the value of that might be that this evolved in my former company, Shell, over 50 years ago, and it has continued to play an important role. And so generations of leaders have found it helpful.
Yeah.
And you can look at examples over almost each decade and say, okay, this helped the company be on the front foot in important developments because it had explored them before. And so, again, not making predictions, but in the very early 70s, there was a set of scenarios that were discussed with the leadership of the company, which included one which had the formation of a cartel among major oil producers. And so when a couple of years later, OPEC formed, you had thought that through. What might the consequences of that be? And so you were able to be on the front foot. And the company was on the front foot, recognizing not only the impacts on the oil price, but the impacts on inflation, the period of stagflation to come, but also, the value of investing in technologies to upgrade heavy oils into more valuable oils. So things like hydroprocessing, hydrocracking, catalytic cracking, all those things were part of that. And you can go through almost kind of decade by decade. So having explored in the early 80s the possibility of the collapse or something with the Soviet Union, brought Shell to be more active in preparing for new East European markets developing. In my time, I think it has helped us as a company, helped Shell as a company be on the front foot in exploring and investing in energy transition activities. So you see this all through. I mean, one of the things that surprises people now is just how significant the natural gas business is for Shell. And that really came through that series of scenarios in the late 90s and things that I was involved with in the early 2000s that showed that in all scenarios, natural gas and particularly liquefied natural gas, was going to play an important role.
Yeah.
And similarly, in the developments, when I first entered the workforce, the company had interests in almost 50 oil refineries around the world, and that has been dialed back now into really focusing around 6 major energy and chemicals establishments. And in fact, the petrochemicals business has grown because the importance of that in energy transition, in producing lightweight materials, for example, is important in all future outlooks. And so again, you see how the pervasive thinking through of possibilities has played into strategic decisions, and some of those have been particularly wise. In fact, I would even say that some of the least wise things that the company has done came when there were periods it fell into a single view of the world, which it tried to optimize to, and then the world turned out differently. So even in a company that uses scenario thinking, it's not necessarily always using it well and all the time. But my perception is, and I've looked at this, that the big errors have come when it's fallen into not thinking in this way.
Yeah, not foreseeing, let's say, multiple ways in which the future could develop itself.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think there was a lot of thinking around it, especially at the end of the 80s, at the fall of the Iron Curtain. I think everyone had an idea of, we can now linear project what the next decades will look like.
You remember Fukuyama and the end
exactly. I wasn't going to say it, but the end of history. Yeah.
And I know with I don't do Francis Fukuyama now, that he was actually thinking much more richly than the way that phrase
that's what they understood.
Interpreted. However, it was a mindset, and hence it was valuable that the company, my former team, was exploring the angry fringes, and ultimately, the angry fringes that first expressed themselves through things like the tragedy of 9/11, but also the increasing fragmentation that's come to the world.
Yeah. Jeremy, it's also an interesting question. Is scenario planning is around, let's say, since the 1950s and gained popularity and traction at the end of the 1960s, 1970s. Has scenario planning as a kind of, in terms of methodology, format, technology, has it evolved since then?
I think the answer is both yes and no. Let me explain. Yes, because the world has evolved, and the kind of challenges that those strong currents we spoke about, have also changed and also evolved. The big economic uncertainties, let's say in the 80s, or the big issues that were playing out would have been around monetary policy, and now it's around fiscal policy. It's about taxation, and services are more prominent because a lot of the monetary aspects have become more stable. And so what you're dealing with evolves, but also you're in the process of trying to surface valuable insights and bring them to life in the minds of others. And I'm coming back to that point. And so as leadership evolves, then how you have to help bring this to life in the minds of leaders evolves as well. And so there's an important connection with leadership and with organizations. And so if you think about the practice in the 70s and 80s, where the organization of Shell was highly distributed amongst with power amongst many operating countries, operating units, then you were looking to influence decisions in that very distributed way. Over time, as the world globalized more, and hence organizations globalized more, you were increasingly focusing on influencing central leadership and influencing distributed leadership. So that evolved. What hasn't evolved is that kind of fundamental about exploring to understand and raise relevant, fresh insights and bring them to life in the minds and the actions of others. So that fundamental nature of integrating this way of thinking into strategic conversations remains the same. But some of the things, some of the ways you do that have evolved and changed. If nothing else, obviously on the technical side, then our capacity to analyze and quantify things has changed. In fact, with the growth of supercomputers in the 60s, the company had invested a lot of effort to try and build programs that would help them predict future markets. And so they were working those hard, and the complete failure of those was actually the stimulus for going in a different direction and doing scenario thinking.
Yeah.
Now, of course, we're years ahead, and modeling of economies, modeling of energy systems is very valuable as part of scenario thinking, but it's a sub part of it because it helps you.
It informs.
It informs. It helps you ask what if questions. It helps you recognize that if you change this, then it inevitably has an impact over there. And so that's also part of the evolution that has come about simply on the technical side. And as I said, on the process side, you're now dealing with people with themselves, a different history in a different types of organization. And so, those are some of the things that have both changed and stayed the same, if that helps answer your question.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. And it might be, let's say, also a little bit connected to something that always surprised me, is that Shell started to share part of its scenario planning with external stakeholders. And that might sound a little bit counterintuitive, because we just discussed the value of scenario planning in the sense of, it helps leaders to mentally be in a different situation. And if the situation occurs, it's kind of territory that they, at least intellectually known and have been. But what was the reason for Shell to let's say, generously share its scenarios, or part of the scenario planning with the wider world? Because you might say, look, it's competitive advantage, and why do you share that?
The background to it is that the company kind of recognized that it's part of a bigger ecosystem. There is public dialogue, there is policy dialogue, and that contributing to better informed dialogue was to the advantage of the company as well as to the advantage of the common good. And so, that was certainly the case. Also, it helped demonstrate thought leadership in these particular areas, which had competitive advantage. The company was, and my predecessors as leaders of the team were invited into areas that wouldn't be accessible if you weren't considered a thought leader. And so I and the team have been involved for several years in my period in helping the Chinese State Council develop, Chinese energy thinking, which we wouldn't have been invited in
No.
without that thought leadership. And we certainly didn't exploit that directly commercially, because then we wouldn't have been invited to be at the table. But it did mean that we understood the Chinese market and the Chinese developments better than most.
Yeah.
And then the other aspect of it is that scenario thinking isn't just about these well-known, multi-decade, global scope type of scenarios that get shared and publicly discussed. Ongoing all the time is scenario thinking more focused around particular areas, whether that may be a country like Brazil, or it may be a particular type of investment like liquefied natural gas complex in Canada, which are more confidential and more commercially sensitive, and that doesn't get shared. But that bigger thinking, what I call the exploratory scenarios, are still forming that focused thinking.
Yeah. Hey, that is a great point. That it gives you that, let's say, that status of being seen as a thought leader also introduces you to, let's say, completely new circles, and provides you access to decision makers that are interested because of, let's say, the value that you bring to their discussions. So that's an interesting aspect.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the ways
Yeah.
that is interesting to think of that is the difference between pervasive influence and percussive impact. So it's rare, it's possible, but it's rare that you see, we took that decision because of that scenario.
Yeah.
And it happens, but it's rare. What really happens is that you have this pervasive influence over time, that people understand situations better than they would have done otherwise, and hence take those wiser decisions.
Yeah, no, I agree. I see a lot of parallels with the work that I typically do in leadership development. I mean, a lot of companies try to establish some kind of holy grail because this person attended this training there. We basically scored this, multi-million-dollar opportunity there. That is not happening. It's more like you prepare people in a certain way of thinking, a certain way of engaging and orienting, and at a certain moment that bears fruit. But no, I fully agree with you. Hey, but what I also find interesting is what comes across, and what always fascinated me in scenario thinking. I always saw it as a kind of combination of an art and a science. I saw it as a kind of the art of being creative and dreaming up things, how the future could evolve, and then analytics to underpin and analyze that with numbers and models. However, what comes across in your work, basically also the work you've done for Shell, but also your work post Shell, is the importance of engagement. Can you share a little bit your thinking about it? Why is engagement so crucial and important in something which is seen as typical high level boardroom exercise?
Yeah, absolutely. Pardon me. It's interesting that you mentioned both art and science, because I refer to the craft, which is kind of that kind of combination.
Yeah.
And in fact, I refer to the two crafts. And so one craft is the visible craft, which is kind of like the technical or the analytical craft of drawing together perspectives and insights from different sources, whether those are different thought leaders in economics or international relations or technology, etc. And you see the technical craft in presentations, or you experience it in the books that are built or something like that. But going back again to what I said earlier about surfacing fresh insights and bringing them to life in the minds and actions of decision makers, that's the social craft. And the social craft is the hidden craft. It has to be somewhat subtle and hidden, because otherwise there is resistance to it. Every single senior leader that I've ever met tells you that they're open to learn. They always are open to learn.
Yeah.
But what I've found is that they detest being taught. That there is something about being senior that makes you think you kind of know it already. You've got deep experience, you've got success in your history, a track record, and so what you've got to do is help create circumstances in which people, senior leaders, learn for themselves, and so you're guiding them, and I use sometimes a little analogy. If you think of Star Wars, the heroes are people like Han Solo and Luke Skywalker, but they're being kind of guided by other Jedi Knights like Yoda.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I kind of like to think, at least of my work and the work of my former team and the people I work with now outside the company, still very active in this area, as the kind of Yodas, the kind of mentors, kind of helping guide decision makers down a valuable pathway for them, where they actually discover things for themselves. And so, we're not the area, and so creating that learning context through engagement is very, very much central to that social craft. And in fact, you may recall one of my illustrious Dutch predecessors, Arie de Geus,
Yeah. Yeah.
and his work on things like the Learning Company. And one of the things that he says, and I think he's correct in this, is that perhaps the only really sustainable competitive advantage is the ability to learn quickly. And so what you're trying to do is engage with people to help them learn, and then you need to know something about how you can do that, and it will be different for different people. So I worked with several chief executives over my period, and they were different people. They kind of learned in different ways, and so you needed to adapt the way you approached them and their teams according to that. It was very much a case that you can learn from what I picked up from those in the broader teaching profession, that when coming into a context, people may be relaxed or they may be tense, and they may be interested or disinterested, and they only really learn if they're relaxed and interested. If they're relaxed and disinterested, they'll go with the flow. If they're tense and it's interesting, it's important to them, you'll get stress reactions. So you really got to help create circumstances where you meet people with where they are, with the issues that they think are important. Even if you're trying to introduce new issues, you have to meet them where they are and create relaxed circumstances in which they're open to that learning. And so, that engagement and that style of engagement is pretty central to that second craft.
Yeah.
And without the second craft, the first craft is kind of meaningless. You need both.
Yeah. You have pointed out the fundamental significance of scenario thinking, but also that the ultimate purpose is making wiser decisions. Do you have any additional guidance on that one, Jeremy?
Yeah. So the first part of it is that engagement.
Yeah.
You integrate this way of thinking into the regular strategic conversations, and so that's kind of one part of it. But also, you can actually do some technical things as well. So if you're thinking about some choices, or if you're thinking about the balance of the portfolio of activities you do, you can kind of map that against the range of scenarios that you think are relevant. And so you almost get a heat map of choices and scenarios. So let's say you have 3 scenarios and 5 types of choice, or 5 different business activities that you're thinking about balancing, and you then can see whether this looks like a good activity or a good choice in this scenario and less good in this scenario. And so you get that, and that, even just having that conversation, enriches the understanding of the situation. But still, you need to collapse that into your ultimate choices around these different choices, or the balance of the different choices for a portfolio. And the danger is that, again, particularly those who are more scientifically trained, like ourselves, or engineering trained, is to somehow try to average that picture down into one thing, or to do, which is effectively the same, which is to think, oh, you can think probabilistically about this, and put some likelihoods on these things and collapse it down in that way.
So some percentages, and then kind of expected impact chance of occurring, and
which isn't helpful. I mean, probabilistic thinking can be helpful, but in very defined and narrow circumstances, and this type of thinking is rarely one of those circumstances. So you've got to be able to deal with this whole picture.
Mm-hmm.
What I have found is what you need is an additional framework for helping collapse this down into your final choices. And so for each scenario, one particular choice will be the best choice in that scenario. And then each of the other choices will have a regret associated with it. And you can look at that across all the scenarios. And what you'll find is all the choices will have some regrets in some scenarios. And then you need a way of thinking. And what I found is the most risk-balanced way of thinking is to then minimize your maximum potential regret.
And I love that phrase.
Very nerdy, but it's actually the way we think. But we don't do it in organizations. We get really, really upset if we make a choice that loses a lot of money. That's a big regret. But we equally get really upset if we miss an opportunity that would have made a lot of money, which is a regret. So thinking about this in regret terms helps balance, if you like, risk and reward thinking. And I've found it a wise way of basically taking that consequence mapping and then using that to have conversations that achieve the final choices.
I love that concept. I came across it in one of your articles, and I really loved it. I thought it was a really, really great way to let's say, decisions, but also, let's say, to have peace with decisions taken, if you understand what I mean. If you made the analysis, then at a certain moment you can say, well, I looked into the abyss, or I looked at the opportunities, and given the information I had then, if I were in the same situation, I probably would have done the same thing.
And you recognize is that even with the choice you made, there are potential regrets. But you've thought very carefully about it. You've had the conversations with everybody about it, and you've concluded together that this has the lowest regrets.
Jeremy, also, and we're coming to your Dodo Club back later, but one of the things you stress in your newsletter is the importance of strategic character. So how would you define strategic character, and why is it important?
Okay. Do you know where the idea came from?
No.
I'll say a little bit about that first. You'll remember there was a major geopolitical event in the early 90s. In the Middle East, you had Desert Storm.
Yeah. Yeah.
That campaign.
Yeah.
And militarily, that was seen as a very successful campaign, and it was
Mhm.
led by a U.S. general, Norman Schwarzkopf.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he was asked about success, and he gave this great quote. And I can imagine him. I think I only ever heard him doing it, but I can imagine him chomping on a big cigar and having this deep, accent. That you need two things for success. You need good strategy, and you need good character. And if you can only have one, have good character. And so I remembered that, and I thought that was.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
But I then thought, well, but yes, but you can have two. You can have strategic character. So
Yeah.
what does that mean? And so I spent quite some time reflecting on what
Yeah.
kind of factors were associated with what I felt was strong strategic character. Looking at different leaders, and I concluded that there were several factors, and I remember them through a mnemonic.
Yeah.
And so mnemonic is so heroes can practice purpose, and it's the first letters of the mnemonic that help me remember these things. So the S really stands for uh, scenario and systems thinking. So you're having this embedded understanding of the plausibility of fundamental alternatives, but also the way they work, thinking systemically. Then the H is humility, because in having the scenario thinking, you have to really respect and embrace and seek out alternative perspectives. And so you have to have the humility to put aside your perspective and find others. The C stands for several things, and they're some of them are obvious. It's about curiosity and creativity, but it's also about collaboration, courage, commitment. These factors. P is from practice is patience and persistence. Not much really often happens overnight, but a lot can happen in a couple of years if you are patient and if you persist in your effort and have that drive. And people only have a drive with the final P, purpose, which is purpose. This sense that what they're doing is meaningful and making an important contribution. And so I think all those things fit together, and you really begin to recognize those characteristics when you look at some of the leaders that you feel have been very effective and good leaders. If we think in international terms, you can look at Nelson Mandela, or you can look at Lee Kuan Yew, and you begin to see a lot of those factors, within them. So that's why I think strategic character is a quite deep thing, but you can strengthen it. You can, through thinking about these factors, you can exercise those muscles in different ways, and that's one of the things that so far I've focused on with the Dodo Club newsletters that you
Yeah.
mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah, because if you take those muscles broader, you're personally engaged with some of the challenges that our society faces. So you're still very involved in addressing the climate crisis. But you've also written about the conflict in Gaza in a kind of micro intervention, which you did a couple of years ago in that area. If and how do you see a role for scenario thinking to contribute to addressing these crises?
Hmm. Well, I think in a number of ways. I mean, so first you can find yourself in crisis, and then you recognize that that's always a period of very radical uncertainty, and you can help kind of come to grips with it. And so I can look into some of my historical experience. I remember when Lehman Brothers collapsed on September the 15th, 2008, the global financial crisis. And I was in front of our executive team within 2 weeks talking about recession and recovery outlooks. And the chief financial officer at the time, Simon Henry, went on the record to say that those conversations helped Shell neither underreact nor overreact to what was going on. And so you can find yourself in those situations. And clearly, what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in Ukraine are those kinds of situations. But you can also learn from examining these situations and think about how what you learn can help in avoiding as much as possible future similar situations. So I think that some geopolitical scenario thinking before all this came forward would have helped, because there was clearly tinder building up that burst into flame with what happened in Gaza, what happened in Ukraine, and so if you look at these situations, certainly most of the scenarios you can develop look like that. This is going to be a deeply tragic problem for a long, long time. There are no silver bullets, there are no quick fixes, and from that learning, as I say, learning is really what you're trying to do. You see that there are 5 things in Gaza, perhaps, that you can think of. You can think about the humanitarian efforts and the humanitarian channels, and putting pressure to ensure those are there. You can think about what I call the Stockdale paradox. Jim Stockdale, you may recall that.
I read it in one of your newsletters. Yeah.
But where you need to be, if you like, brutally honest about the situation you're in, but still committed to seeking light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
That you will prevail eventually, and so we have to be brutally honest about the tragic circumstances that we're in, but look forward and think about what other potentially tragic situations, no, actually tragic situations there have been, and how things have worked through. So if we think about apartheid in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation movement in the post-apartheid times was really, really significant in helping avoid a lot of bloodshed and helping a society move forward. So you can learn from those kinds of developments. I have experience years ago working with young people from both Israel and Palestine. And when you get young people together and they learn from each other and they see their commonalities, and that's at a time when their future minds are being really shaped. There's a huge amount of shaping of minds between the ages of 14 or 15 and 25. That's something you can do, and you can attend to those situations where you can see tinder building up elsewhere already. And so, these are some of the lessons you can learn from both looking at the current situation, but also through some scenario thinking.
Yeah. No, I agree with you, and I think it's also one of the points you raised is also the one that that gives me a certain hope in these type of situations. We as a society have addressed certain things before. I think you mentioned South Africa. I think one of the things that I always find very interesting was a seemingly hopeless situation in Northern Ireland, for instance, where somehow because I think at the time you and I grew up, this seemed like this is going on. This lasted hundreds of years. It will go on hundreds of years. That somehow.
So that's another great example that a seemingly intractable situation. Progress has been made. It's not perfect.
No.
But real progress has been made.
Yeah. Hey, what I also find interesting is after you retired from your corporate career in Shell as a VP Global Business Environment and Shell Scenarios Leaders, you started the Dodo Club, of which I'm a very enthusiastic member, and I think the club definitely deserves more members. So perhaps you could explain the reference to the unfortunate dodo, where it stems from, but also, what is the purpose of the club, and perhaps most importantly, how can people join?
Okay, no, thank you for mentioning that. The dodo. Most people know the fate of that unfortunate bird,
Yeah,
which was perfectly adapted to its circumstances, but then the circumstances changed, and I think part of that change was the Dutch arrived. But
yeah, yeah. I think we have some blame to take for that. Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
but the dodo became the symbol of the scenario activities in Shell because effectively the task was to help avoid Shell ever going the way of the dodo. And so there was uh, a symbol and even a plaque, which was informally handed down from person to person, giving them this responsibility for the company without any authority, but just responsibility for the company. So I was the holder of the dodo for
I
many
didn't
years.
know that. I didn't know that. I never
Okay.
knew that. Yeah, yeah,
So there is the Dodo Club, or the Dodo plaque.
yeah.
And so when thinking about you know, my own desire to kind of really help promote, uh, putting it in simple terms, a better life for people with a healthy planet, then sharing insights that have developed from my own experience, but also gathering the experience and insights of others became a natural part of what I was hoping to do, and hence beginning to develop the Dodo Club. And the idea is that members of the Dodo Club share experience and help each other individually, but also collectively, avoid the fate of the unfortunate bird and actually prosper in helping to um, uh, promote a better life with a healthy planet. The anthropologist Margaret Mead used to say something like, um, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that has ever changed the world. And so I don't know whether the Dodo Club will change the world. That's not very humble, and I think they can. But I think that by expressing and sharing experience, we can do that. And in fact, as well as the fortnightly newsletter that people can comment on, in the next period, we're going to introduce a webinar series. And there are courses that people will be able to sign up to and follow, online courses, as well as um, round table face to face discussions that we can have. So I'm hoping that in the next short period, we will enhance the club beyond the newsletters. So if people are interested in that and can find it useful in developing and strengthening their own strategic character and insights, they can subscribe. I'm sure perhaps you have a
Yeah, I'll,
website.
I'll include the subscription details in the show notes below. Yeah, yeah.
That's great, but it's basically easy to find if you were to Google or use whatever finder that you have. Then the Dodo Club, one word, .beehive.com, and Beehive is spelled Beehive, so it's not the English spelling, it's Beehive.com. Then Dodo Club Beehive.com, you'll find you can sign up to the newsletter, and it'd be great to have more people involved, because as we go forward, the more people who are involved, as with any network, the more powerful it becomes.
I agree. I fully agree. Now, and I can recommend everyone to sign up for membership. it is really a great source of inspiration, and it's these kind of bi-weekly strategic inputs. I think we can all do very well with. So, thank you for starting that, Jeremy.
Yeah, pleasure.
Jeremy, we had a in this podcast we had an opportunity to reflect on strategic thinking and decision making from a number of different angles. Are there any final words from you on this topic? Any final thoughts, things that we may not have paid attention to, things that you would like to stress a bit more?
Well, if I can begin with some words from another one of my illustrious Dutch predecessors, Kees van der Heijden, who wrote a book with the subtitle "The Gentle Art of Reperceiving," and recognizing that strategic conversation, including the scenario mindset, was about the gentle art of reperceiving. And so, just taking an example that we mentioned South Africa earlier, and people expected a bloodbath, and it was because the different parties there were kind of seeing developments as a zero-sum game that needed to be fought over, whereas with help from people who were in actually this scenario team, Adam Kahane at the time, people like that, they did some scenario exercises together and recognized actually thinking of this as a zero-sum game was a pathway to mutual destruction, and seeing instead that a reconciliation pathway was a game, if you like, that was a much healthier game for all parties. So this shift in perception from a zero-sum game to a positive-sum game was really important. And in one of the areas that I'm very active in currently, energy transitions, because of the nature of the dialogue over the last decades, this is largely perceived by most people as a slow-moving, costly, supply-led, hard slog. Whereas if you actually look at where there has been progress, for instance, in the takeoff of battery electric vehicles or the growing use of solar or wind in power generation, you actually see that it's when things happen, it's really a series of high opportunity, fast moving, demand led, modest cost tipping points of uncertain timing. And if you see that, you begin to shift your perception from being this is costly and so should I move fast or slow into this is a tipping point that's coming. It could be a high opportunity or it could be a big threat. Am I better being on the front foot or waiting to see what happens? And so you actually shift the whole strategic question around.
It's more like looking at the S curve in the sense of where do I enter the S curve?
And so I think that behind all the things we've spoken about, which are helpful for people, is the sense that you could, part of this, it's not all of it, but part of this is about understanding the world in different ways and sometimes better ways. And so I hope people will take that away with them as well.
Jeremy, I learned so much, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. So thank you so much for participating in this podcast. It's I think I really gained a lot of new insights, and I think it will be tremendously valuable for people who view and listen to this podcast as well. So thank you for all the time and energy that you invested in it, and also for the different viewers and listeners, I will include the show notes below. They basically have links to the Dodo Club of Jeremy, but also to some documents around scenario planning in general, and also scenario planning in the context of the climate change. So, thank you, Jeremy.
Oh, thank you, Dirk. Thank you for inviting me. And I do hope I've enjoyed our conversation, so thank you for that. But I also
Me
do
too. Me
hope
too.
that others find it helpful as well. And yeah, I look forward to the next time we chat.
Thank you.